Back in December of 2020, Cyberpunk 2077 launched with arguably one of the biggest flops of the decade. CD PROJEKT RED at the time was one of the most beloved studios, and very few people you asked had anything bad to say about them. How could you, right? CD PROJEKT RED had been developing the Witcher series since 2007, and every iteration of that series was an absolute banger, so anyone who enjoyed the genre loved CD PROJEKT RED. Looking back at Cyberpunk's launch, I would argue that the launch of the game was not nearly as bad as other game titles. Of course, it had tons of issues, there was no doubting that, but I think what really killed Cyberpunk was how high of an expectation that the game had set for itself or by the fans. At the time, I don't recall a single person who didn't believe Cyberpunk would be the next big game, the game to end all games, and while typically not a doomer, I didn't see it that way. What I saw was a game that had to launch perfect. Now when I spoke to the people in the community, I got a lot of hate from it. The funny part was I didn't actually hate the thought of the game. If anything, this game was exactly what I wanted from a modern open world title. No, my concern came from the fact that if this game was not perfect in every way, then CD PROJEKT RED and Cyberpunk would be, well, doomed. Now we all know the story of Cyberpunk since then. CD PROJEKT RED went from one of the most beloved studios to one of the most disliked and disappointed studios to what I would call now in 2023 an optimistically good studio. CD PROJEKT RED, in my opinion, actually never dealt with failure of this scale, as well as the fans, and hell, besides maybe Bethesda, very few studios have. But there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that is the improvements and most importantly the upcoming changes for Cyberpunk 2077 coming this September in the 2.0 update and the Liberty City DLC. For the last couple of weeks, I've been talking to a lot of players, asking them about their experience with Cyberpunk. Typically, I get an answer like I've played it for the first few days and dropped it. Occasionally, some say they play it for a month before moving on, and more often than not, due to the game's negative reputation, many players simply didn't give it a chance. Suzi Hunter over at the Spear Hunter channel, link in the description to her channel, actually got to test the upcoming changes, and here's what she had to say about them. So I got to play a lot of the Phantom Liberty, and my ultimate takeaway is that in the past 3 years, CD PROJEKT RED had essentially remade the entire game. Every single fundamental and mechanic is improved. Like even the character models have been remodeled. Leveling is now skill based, so you're unlocking new attacks and abilities, not just getting small stat increases. Clothes no longer give you stats or armor unless it's literal armor. Stats can come from your cyberware, which placed greater emphasis on customization. Leveling cyberware on a new skill tree unlocks special abilities like overdriving your gorilla arm punch, smacking enemies into the stratosphere. AI is vastly improved, they block and hide behind cover. I couldn't just run up to a single target and kill it easily. The melee combat feels a lot better, and dodging is now its own button. You can anime zip to a point now instead of doing that tiny hop. There are also stylish executions on his own buttons, and you can block bullets with your blade weapon. And honestly, there's too many other changes and improvements to recall right now. It's like a brand new game. All of these changes are also coming in the base game, it's not just in the expansion, and the entire game has been redone with this stuff. Now the reason I wanted to discuss this first is that I believe many players are still of the mindset that Cyberpunk, to say the least, is a game that didn't come close to living up to its expectations. The most important takeaway for me from Suzi's post was the emphasis on the game feeling new, and the fact that the base game is actually receiving massive changes, making the entire game a brand new experience. In my opinion, this is very healthy for the players who want to actually give the game another chance. Suzi talked about the AI getting massive improvements, mainly combat improvement, but we actually didn't talk about the changes on how the police function within the game. If you've ever played Red Dead, there's a mechanic in the game where you can basically change your appearance and could lose some to all of the heat from the authorities, and that's actually coming to Cyberpunk. The AI changes we've mentioned extend beyond that, as the whole system has been rebuilt from the ground up. Not only will you have more levels for Wanted, but you actually have more archetypes of enemies that will scale. Now while this isn't exactly new to the genre, while in Night City, obviously the NCPD will attack you, but in Dogtown, a new militia will be there to stop you, and from what I can tell, they're much more dangerous than the Night City PD, and get this, with many bosses that you can actually face off against, which is pretty cool if you ask me. Outside of attacking you, the factions will attack others, like chase them and stuff, and it feels like a real world experience, and honestly this is a pretty exciting addition. Now, in addition to those combat changes, they actually added some vehicle combat, and according to Sasako, we put a lot of work into vehicle combat. You can aim your handgun through the windshield or windows. There are also weaponized vehicles with Gatling guns or rockets that can actually use and shoot. Some of the cars from the base game will be updated and weaponized, whereas others you can just open the door, like from our original CGI trailer where V was shooting out of the door. On motorcycles, you can use your katana. So there is a massive change in the emphasis on vehicle combat. You'll be able to actually use more weapons. From what I can tell, it's not going to be like every vehicle or whatever, but some new vehicles will have it, some of the old vehicles will have it, and you can pretty much go around on a motorcycle with a katana and slice people up, which is pretty cool. More combat improvements that's going to add to the game, add to the police system to make the chases feel more engaging and interesting, and these are the changes that I think are going to really set apart the game from the previous couple of years to the current time where Cyberpunk 2077 is actually shaping up to be that game that a lot of people actually was thinking it was going to be. Now, I've been discussing the improvements to the game, and while I haven't covered everything like the brand new skills and how the skill system work, or the totally revamped melee combat, I think it's important to mention some things about the DLC as well. From what I can tell, the DLC is a sizable expansion. We've discussed the black market, but not what the new zone has to offer. As I mentioned, you probably won't be facing off with the NCPD as much as you'll be facing off against Kurt Hinson and his force. Kurt is essentially the main antagonist who controls most of Yawk City. This brings about a complete rework of the area, where the world has been replaced with his militia and other enemy factions as Dogtown falls outside of NCPD's jurisdiction. It's interesting to know that Kurt's militia is composed of soldiers rather than police officers, which is why they're considered more dangerous. Although we don't have much information on the base story, it seems that you can start the DLC right after the Voodoo Boys encounter. Dogtown is divided into 3 major zones: the upper, lower, and downtown, which has its own unique atmosphere, and additionally there are factions within these zones that often engage in conflict with one another, as I said earlier. Fortunately, during these conflicts, you will have the tools needed to face them. CD PROJEKT RED has taken the time to flesh out how the stats and gear work. There's been brand new additions to the skill tree, adding completely new skills and revamping others. Upgrades are more focused on your cyberware versus just equipping a slightly better yellow jacket, and stats on the weapons are way more robust, offering new stats like recoil control while covered, universally adding penetrations on weapons, and new damage modifiers, and much more. This extends also to melee weapons, as there will be major updates on the weapon types and their stats. New skills that can be used to set up cyberware in more interesting ways, but a lot of this comes at the cost of your humanity. To some extent, you'll have to balance this out, as there will be negatives to overdoing it whenever you're adding it to your cyberware, but there are actually some secrets within the game that will help you push the envelope within your skills, weapons, and cyberware. Honestly, at this point, it really does look like Cyberpunk has made some incredible improvements to the game. I'm personally excited to jump in and try some new cyberware, weapons, and the AI changes. I can't wait to experiment with the different builds and see what crazy combinations I can come up with, but if you're on the fence about giving it another chance, I strongly encourage you to read up on the upcoming changes. Personally, I will be playing the game and covering the upcoming 2.0 changes. If you want to stay up to date with the game, I suggest subscribing to the channel. I'll be keeping you informed as the game evolves, and you'll be able to stay up to date. Now, this is going to be pretty much the end of the video. I really appreciate you guys stopping by and watching. Thank you for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video very soon. Later.